Today we're going to we decided to just tell an anecdote from Michael's life, and maybe we'll do a couple like this where he just tells a story and the circumstances surrounding that story. So go ahead, Michael.
Well, it's interesting because I'm going to be 77 at the end of October, and I've been thinking about my life. As my friend Big Boy Medlin says, everything feels like a finale at this age. He's a year older than me. It feels like you're going to see someplace the last time, talk to somebody the last time. Not in a morbid way. You're just being realistic. Friends are dying right and left. And and uh, and I've been wondering about my life. I know what I survived, but what in me helped me survive? What around me helped me survive? Has been a question I've been asking myself. Not in some big philosophical way. Just what I've called for a long time the mechanics of event. How did this and that and the other happen? There were things I chose. There were things that chose me. And so when we talked about doing this instantly, came to my mind a story that really starts in Waterville, Maine, where I was in my high school years, the ward of a minister and his family, the Laws family, Skipper Laws, the minister, and Gracia Laws, his wife, his son Carl, his daughters Judy and Marianne. And the thing about Waterville, Maine, he was the Unitarian minister of the old church on Silver and Elm, and lived across the street from the church, the house owned by the church. And I went to school there, what was called the New England Country Day School. You took a test to get in, although I think they let me in anyway, because I was a minister's ward and came from a poor background. They weren't used to that in Waterville, Maine, because in Waterville, Maine in 1960, when we got there, I've researched it about a year ago, and it was at the height of its 20th century population. It was almost 20,000 people, virtually all white. The people not considered white were the French Canadian laborers. They were the underclass of that area. And Maine has had a very stable population, not even quite 1 million people back then. And Portland and Bangor are its cities, and they're not that big. Waterville, as I said, was about 20,000. But it was at its zenith in the sense that all the stores were occupied, were stores serving the county. There's Colby College up on the hill, which had a reputation, still does, as a good college. And it was a functioning town. Now, I know I haven't been there in many, many years, 30 years, but I know that, like most towns of that kind, the stores are either boutiques of one kind or another, or they're closed. There's probably a shopping center on the edge of town with a Walmart and some movie theaters, and they've gone the way of small towns. But at that time, nobody knew that was going to happen. Nobody expected that to happen. Everybody talked about how great everything was going to be in the year 2000, and it was onward and upward. It was the year of the Kennedy-Nixon election, 1960. Republicans were not what they are today. One could disagree honorably, and half my class, which was a small class at Coburn, was Republican, and it was only about 15 kids, and about half was Democrat, and were one of the first coeducational schools in North America. And it taught in that New England tradition of education, which was profound and goes back to the 17th century, the 1600s. Boston Latin School for Boys was the first public school of note in the country, in what was then the colonies. Harvard was the first university. And education was seen as, in the New England tradition, as something that taught you your heritage as a human being. That's why you studied Latin, studied Greek in high school. I flunked Latin, by the way. Studied French, when French was really, if you were looking to the future, already you'd have been studying Spanish if you wanted something useful. If you'd really been clairvoyant, you'd have been studying Chinese. But it wasn't that French was a useful language. It was that for about 300 years to be cultured meant to be able to speak French as well. And in Europe, it was what English is now. Anybody educated could speak some French, no matter what else they were speaking. But the point I'm making, it was a classical education in the sense of the idea wasn't to get a job. The idea was to have some sense of what your heritage as a human being is culturally. And the standards at Coven were very high. The classes were small. The teachers were varied kinds of people. And as I said, it was all white. It was 98% Christian, I would imagine. But New England Christian, which had gone far from the Puritans, and very tolerant. Tolerance was an ideal in New England tradition. Whether they practiced it or not, it was an ideal. So we learned, what am I trying to say? School was strenuous. For my senior year in English, we read novels, and at the end of the year, we were supposed to write my paper was 20-odd double-spaced typed, which is about 5,000 words. I probably went over the limit, because I usually did, but it was supposed to be a substantial paper, about 4,000 words, about 16 typed pages, comparing all the books that we'd read, and stating what our philosophy of life was. We were supposed to have one. And the history paper, and I think I've talked about this, my history paper that I was specifically given, each of us in this class of about 13, we give a specific subject, was 4,000 words on the Jefferson Embargo Act, which I'd never heard of, using prime sources, which I had to go down to Augusta, the capital of Maine, about 100 miles away. And to the library there to get a prime source, being a document or memoir of that time about that subject. Whether it's the decree of that time, whether it's the newspaper articles of that time about the Jefferson Embargo Act. Historians were secondary sources, prime sources of the documents and witness statements themselves. And I had to use historians, obviously, to find the prime sources, but I had to go back to the prime sources. And this is great training for my life as a public writer, a columnist, a journalist, if you like, but insisting on prime sources. And, as I said, documents of the time or reliable witnesses of the time. And comparing various newspaper articles, for instance, of the time. So comparing the New York Times, which started in the early 1800s, Goddard College, I didn't want to go to college. I just went to college because everybody said go to college. And I didn't have anything better to do, I thought. And because in those days, a high school diploma was enough to get you a decent job. To get a decent starting position where you'd make the kind of living that you could live a decent upper working class, lower middle class life. If you were a man, a woman, all the young women in my class, and they were smart, most of them, expected to be housewives, teachers, or nurses. And that was the real expectation. That was what they thought they were capable of. I mean, the society thought. These women, I know at least two or three of them did a lot more than that. But that was the expectation. So I chose Goddard College because my grades weren't that good. And it seemed like a place where creativity was fostered. In Plainfield, Vermont, tiny little town, dot on the map in Vermont. And I've lived in New England now, through high school in Massachusetts and then Maine. Vermont was familiar. And so I went there, and instantly I knew that Goddard College was nowhere near as good a place of education as my high school. that Goddard College could not compare in terms of thoroughness of education to my high school. That the young people I met there, most of whom were from New York City, and the suburbs of New Jersey and Long Island and such, and Boston. Everyone's from Boston. They weren't as set on education as the smarter kids at Coburn. I met Mikey Berger there. You met him. He died about 3 years ago. And I like Mikey, and I just liked each other right off. Nobody else called him Mikey but me. He called me Mikey. Nobody else called me Mikey but him. It was Mikey and Mikey. Right from the beginning. We were 17 years old. I would turn 18 at the end of October. He would turn 18 in January. And Mikey said he was going to be an opera singer. And I knew he was bullshitting me because Goddard didn't have a classical music program. And somebody else said he was going to be a writer. He was walking around with a blindfold and a cane. And when he bumped into people, he would tell them, he's a writer, he's writing a story about a blind person. And he had to do this. This went on for days. And I didn't say, because I was shy of this new place, but it wasn't an incarnation in me that would say, look, to understand what it is to be blind, you don't take the blindfold off. They can't. Bumping into things doesn't make you understand the blind guy. But, I just kept my eyes and ears open. I was used to being a stranger. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. And I'm there about 2 weeks. Yes, almost exactly 2 weeks. And it's the 21st of September. And I'm calling my mother. It's her birthday. My mother had been in and out of mental hospitals. She'd been fine. She'd come to my graduation in May, the previous June. She was terrific. But she lived because she was a mental patient, because New York State and New York City, even now, is much, much better than anywhere else in the country if you have these kind of problems. They really try to take care of people. And she lived in a city-supported hotel where they paid part of the rent, and she was on 77th and Broadway to Ben Franklin. Not there anymore, and that's a rich neighborhood now. It was a tough neighborhood. It was the neighborhood of Taxi Driver. It was the neighborhood of Panic and Needle Park. But you expected, if you were working class, to live in a tough neighborhood. It didn't look like it as a hardship or something. It was going to be, New York City was tough in those days. And when I come to New York visiting relatives, I get a room at the Ben Franklin. It was very cheap. No TVs, radio, and a little room, basically enough for a bed, single bed, a radio on a stand, bathroom, your stuff, I'd seen her recently, comparatively. First my graduation in New York for a week or so in the summer. And I called her up. Like, hotel said they couldn't find her. I called her up again, tried. They couldn't find her. I called her brother, my Uncle Aldo, who I was never on good terms with. Long story there. And he, with his resources, when he had some. And also, calls were not casual like now. I can just call you in Canada, and we can talk for an hour.
Yeah.
To do this in 1962, this is the beginning of 1963, rather, or the fall of 1963, to situate us properly. To do that in the fall of 1963 would have cost us $30-40. Long distance call was a long distance call. It cost you money. And so these calls were very short. I didn't have the money for them. My Uncle Albert called me. He had the money for them. At the office of the college, because of course there were not mobile phones in those days. And he said to me that my mother had a bad breakdown, mental breakdown, and she was in a mental hospital on Long Island called Kings Park. And I got chills down my spine because I knew that place. It was awful. And just because the state really did try to help people, not put them on the street, it doesn't mean that all the institutions they ran were good. But by comparison, the biggest mental hospital in California is the Los Angeles City Prison, where people are put out of sympathy. Really, they're held until they're not so bad, or they're tranked up or something. This was a hospital, it wasn't a prison. It just was a terrible place. The vibe of it was terrible. You walked in there and it was awful. So I had to get to New York. I wanted to see my mother. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, and concurrent with this, Mikey and I had met Victor Lopez. And Victor Lopez was an exile from Spain 28 years before, which is to say 1936. He had fought on the side of the Republic in the Spanish Civil War against Franco, who was supported by Nazi Germany, and Mussolini's Italy. And after the Republic forces, the socialists and the anarchists and the communists who could never agree on anything, that's why they lost. After they were defeated in 1939, he, like many, sought refuge in France, and as France sought refuge in the United States, and he was living in exile. He was an alcoholic, a tiny, rotund man with a huge voice. And he'd known, or said he'd known, Federico Garcia Lorca. He would recite Lorca's poetry, bring him a bottle of wine, and that's what we'd done already. We were only there 2.5 weeks. Bring Victor Lopez wine, and of course we weren't old enough to buy wine legally, but we managed. Bring Mr. Lopez wine and start him off, and he would rant about the war and recite Lorca wonderfully. I mean, and he liked having the attention. He liked it quite a lot. So Mikey says, these people are going with Mr. Lorca to his doctor in New York City. And you can go with them. See, he made the connections. I was kind of too stunned to make anything. I pack a bag, little valise, suddenly I get there where I'm supposed to be on the campus, and suddenly I'm told, "No, we're not doing this. Victor's too sick. He's gonna have to go somewhere local." And I just looked around. Well, I guess I'm hitchhiking then. I got to get there. My mother's in the hospital, and Mikey said, "I can't. I should do that alone." I said, "Well, you're welcome. Try your luck." And this woman named Lorraine, who was beautiful and blonde and quiet, said, "Oh, can I come with you?" And yeah, sure, beautiful blonde and quiet, come with us to Mikey's place in the Bronx. And suddenly, the three of us are on the road, 2-lane in Vermont, hitchhiking toward New York City. We got a ride, and then we got a ride, and then we're somewhere near Albany. And hitchhiking to get there, we had one incident, which was we're hitchhiking, and we didn't want to put Lorraine out front because we ain't gonna get the wrong kind of attention. I'm on the road. Mikey's back off with Lorraine a little bit, and a couple of lads in a pickup are passing me, and they give me the finger, and I give them the finger back, which was stupid. And they hit the brakes. They back up. They were big country boys, like kind of New York City, New York State, rural country. And, I'm not a big guy, to say the least, and neither was Mikey. And I forget, they said something. "Oh, you want us to come out?" That kind of thing. They would want to come out and fight. But they'd given me one finger, and I'd given them one finger, and I just looked at them and said, "One for one." And they said something else, and I said, "One for one." And it worked. They left. I don't even know what that meant. I was thinking, you gave me the finger, I gave you the finger. One for one. But they decided that, and you've got to remember, I'm about 125 pounds. My front teeth are gone. I don't mean they're absent totally, but they're rotted. And my hair's longer than in 1963 rather, was fashionable. And were permitted. Not that I was a hippie or anything like that. It was just longer. Like, I could try to comb it like Elvis when I could. And I'm standing there in the middle of nowhere, and they just decided to hell with it and moved on. So that was a bit of adventure. But then we get to Albany, around somewhere in the vicinity of Albany, which is about 3 or 4 hours above New York City, if you're taking the thruway, which at the time was quite exotic because the interstate highway system really was just beginning. I mean, there were very few what we call interstates now then. And most roads that are 4 lanes now were 2 lanes now. And we're in the rain. And this huge 18-wheeler stops. And these 2 African-American guys get out of the cab. At the time, it was you referred to African-Americans as Negroes. That was the accepted term. There are a lot of unaccepted terms, but that was the accepted term. And they get out. One name was Al, and I can't remember the name of the other guy. Al was about my size, very intense eyes, friendly face. The other guy was bigger and quieter, but also kind of just smiling at his partner. And he said, "No room." And hear myself say, and I still can't believe I did this, can we ride in the truck? And the truck was empty. They were making an empty run. I didn't know anything about trucking at the time. But it costs a lot of money to make an empty run. So they were coming back from delivering something, is the likelihood. Maybe up to Canada. It's suspicious to have a big truck like that when it's running on long distances empty. It really doesn't happen much. But I didn't know all that, didn't think all that at the time. And I said in the back, could we? And this guy looks at me and says, yeah, I think so, okay. Fastens one of the back doors open, so that it's not going to close on us and we're not just in there, like that. And there's some boxes that we could sit on, or we just sit on the floor. And then all he said was, when we get to the toll booth, stay way in the back of the, stay as far from the back doors anyway, stay way in the front.
Yeah.
In the shadows, don't let him see you. I said, sure. What's the address we're going to? I couldn't believe this. And Mikey tells him the address in the Bronx. By this time, it's about 9 o'clock at night. And, it must have been later than that. Must have been more like 11 o'clock. Remember, we were going 2 lanes. And hitchhiking, getting rides. You don't, when you're hitchhiking, you don't get out of one ride and then suddenly get another. It can take a couple hours to get out. And we get in this truck. And it heads for New York. We had, Mikey and I were both New York City street kids. I'm the Brooklyn Italian type, he's the Bronx Jewish type, but we're both New York City street kids. We both don't trust easily. We both have an eye for who's for real and who's not. So we weren't worried about anything. And we figured these guys were good guys. And here they want to take us all away. And it's not like we can pay them. We got about $5 between us. Which was enough to buy a lunch and a dinner for all 3 of us in those days. So then we were in the back of the truck with Lorraine being mysterious and silent, and Mikey and I just being, man, look what we're doing. We're really doing this. And driving down there, and it was a New York thruway, so it was 2 lanes each way. I don't think either of us spent much time in any kind of situation like that on the road. And it was raining, and you had the rain, and you had the headlights going behind us, following us, and you had the taillights on the other side going away, and you had this big night, and what a truck will throw, the spray that a truck throws when it's going through the rain. So all of this is a spray, and the spray is lit by the headlights behind us. And we were happy. We were just thrilled. We were really doing this. We were 17 and free, and we'd defended a woman against danger. Not really, but and Lorraine wanted to go to there's a big horse show at Madison Square Garden, and that's where she was heading. God knows why. We never asked. Never had a conversation again. And we were headed for the Bronx. And it was a moment of innocence and excitement. And the innocence was real. There weren't drugs in the high school then. And it was not unusual that Mikey and I were 17 years old and still virgins. That was normal then. No matter what made sense. I mean, given my childhood, I knew that nothing was permanent, nothing could be counted on, nothing was going to necessarily work the way you wanted it to work. But here we were, actually doing this, and it was working. It was for real. It was daylight by the time we got to Mikey's place up in the Bronx, which is right below the Little Washington Bridge. I mean, it's right across from the bridge. And the truck couldn't quite make the turn into the street. Because Al, the truck driver, he wanted to lead us right at Mikey's. We couldn't pay him. I think we stopped on the way somewhere and eaten something. We paid for ourselves. You know, all we could do was thank him, shake hands and thank him. They smiled and shook our hands, and off they went. and we go inside and meet Mikey's parents. Now, Mikey lived in a Bronx apartment. I think it was Tremont Street. And it was big for a Bronx apartment. It was 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen. But New York apartments are pretty cramped. But it was a nice working middle-class Bronx apartment. And we walk in. There's an enormous grand piano. Fills almost the whole living room. There's a conductor's podium. Mikey's father, Ben Berger, is standing with earphones on, conducting a symphony from the music sheet on the podium. He's being the conductor of the symphony he's listening to through earphones. And he's doing that and doesn't give a flying anything about who's in or out. That's what he's doing. Not hi, hello, how are you? Not anything of embarrassment. He's conducting his symphony. Dorothy, his mother, has a broad New York Jewish accent, and she makes us food. One thing Dorothy could not do was cook, even a little bit. And everything Dorothy made, bless her heart, was terrible. But she just ate it. That's all. And we hadn't slept. And she arranges, I don't know. I slept in a chair. Mikey slept on his bed. Lorraine slept in his brother's room. I guess it was 2, 3 bedrooms, I guess. That was a lot in New York City there. So that night, I go to my first opera with Dorothy and Ben and Mikey. And it's a Traviata. It's at the Brooklyn Opera House. We drive there in Ben's car. Old car, like early 50s car. And Ben and Mikey are experts at opera. And we are in the cheap seats up in the bleachers. They don't call it that. I forget what they call it. And I don't like opera music much. I don't like it at all, in fact, unless I'm actually listening to it, and then it's fun. I mean, in live.
Yeah.
And I'm having a high old time. A bunch of guys come out with swords and salute the audience and all this stuff. Everybody's clapping. But the guy they came to see, the tenor they came to see, was being substituted by this singer who was regularly employed, a professional opera singer, but not a lead, just there in case the lead gets sick. The lead had gotten sick or something, been delayed. And his name was Murray. And as he's doing his big number, where he has to really hit, Mikey and Ben are going, can he hit the high C? I don't think he whatever the high note was, I don't know if it's the high C. Can he hit that high note? No, I don't know. Maybe he can hit that high note. I don't think he can hit that high note. And other people were having the same kind of reaction around us. He goes, come on, Murray, get the, he's going to get it, you're going to get it. He didn't get it. And the whole place is like that. and then the next day, and this all does have a point, then the next day, subways and trains. I take the subway to the Long Island Railroad. Spend the last of my money. I knew Uncle Alton was going to give me some money to get back on. And he picks me up at a railroad station, and we go and visit my mother in Kings Park. I think it was Kings Park. Kings something. And she's behind 3 locked doors. Open a locked door. They take you through a long hall that smells funny. To another locked door. To another long hall. Another locked door. In the visiting room. She looks like hell. She's tranked up to the gills, so she's not making sense, but she's very, very glad to see me. And, you know how it is, it's your mother. And in my situation, I'd done what I could. Yeah, I went to see her. I wasn't a kid in school anymore. High school. And Uncle Aldo was driving me back to the station. He gave me some money, like $20, which was like $100 now at least. And he said, he still had a Sicilian accent. And Uncle Aldo's a historian himself. He was one of the scientists at Los Alamos. He worked on the electronic devices that were needed to set the bomb off. He worked on, he made a business, made a lot of money, doing defense projects, whatever they were in the 1950s, I don't know. He had a bomb shelter in his backyard. And he was a very, very smart, intellectually smart. I don't mean like smart, but I've known a lot of people who are really intellectually brilliant, don't know shit about how to live, including myself for a long time. And he said, and I'll try to do his accent, but I don't know if I can still do it. He said, Michael, when your mother is better, maybe next spring, maybe next summer, I'll give you the money, and I'll stop doing the accent, to set up an apartment with her in the Bronx. And you'll get a job. And your mother can get a clerical job. You'll find some work. And stabilize things for a few months, and then you get your sister out of St. Joseph's Children's Home. Will you do this? I remember standing in my shoes and then looking up, and there was a gull kind of gliding. And the sky was pale, it wasn't blue, pale whitish. And I just said a simple yes. I didn't give it a second thought. I don't mean I was a hero or anything like that. I was the eldest. My family had been shattered by mental illness, by poverty, by the desertion of an abdication of responsibility by our father. And I said yes. I never second guessed it. It was clearly my job to get my sister out of the home and into her own life again. What could be her own life. And so that weekend, Mikey and I called it the weekend. For the rest of our lives, we called it the weekend. And Mikey had read a lot of books I'd never even heard of at the time. Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet, the novels of Willa Cather. And we've been reading this poet, James Wright. And I understand, school had only been about 2 weeks. But we were voracious intellectuals. We were really voracious for knowledge, for education. And so we we were each other's education, and God a lot more than God was our education. And reading this poet James Wright, and in one of his poems, the poem doesn't work as a whole, but there's the line, "Only the truth is kind." And we, honestly, 17 years old, we didn't know how much, couldn't guess how much we would fail that line. But it did sink into us. It was there, and we were those kinds of friends when we were young, especially with each other. And so I got back to school. I don't remember how. Mikey went with me, and somehow it was. This will sound weird, but somehow it was freeing. I could do this year of school. Why not? It was already paid for, and I had a scholarship, somewhat, a loan, something. Not like today, but. And do the school year, why not? When my mother got out of the hospital, I'd get a job. What could I do? I could type. I've been typing since I was 13 years old. In those days, if you could type in New York City, you could get a job. A man could get a job. Most places in the country didn't want men typing, unless they were typesetters, which I eventually did too. So I had a skill. I could type. I'd get a job. And enter the life of adulthood without, any buffers. It was clear that if I was going to be educated, I was going to have to educate myself. And if I was going to be a writer, well, how can I be a writer? When my mother, and here the story will end, because here I'd had a taste of what I really wanted to do, an adventure, a wonderful, magical even, night of freedom when anything seemed possible. And a day and a half later, that slammed shut. And it seemed I was going to have another fate. And I had said yes. Could have said no. Never occurred to me to say no. Again, not because of any kind of heroics on my part. Simply, I'm the eldest son, I'm the firstborn in the entire clan. If I'm asked to do this, this is my duty, I do it. Anybody, any of us, of the firstborns, me, my cousin Tony Callie and his family, my cousin Rocco Labasco and his family, they'd have done the same. And so fast forward a bit to the next August, and my mother gets out of the hospital. Now my mother is only, at this time, 62. She's only 44. I'm 63, she's 45. It's kind of a different country. Kennedy's been killed in November. The Beatles have changed rock and roll in December. It's kind of a different country. And with my uncle's money, my mother and I are down on Union Square, going to department stores and getting me clothing to put jobs in, had to have a tie, etc. And it's New York City. You need a fall wardrobe, And by wardrobe, we just mean, a couple of changes of clothes. We're not talking anything fancy. But you need clothes for fall, for winter, for spring, and for summer. They're really, especially then, distinctively different seasons. And we're walking along, and I said, Ma, the only thing I'm worried about is when this is all over, will I still be a writer? And she looked at me very succinct. Not harsh, although it sounds harsh, but she said, when this is all over, you'll know whether or not you're a writer. Period. No elaboration. She was right. So as they say in Texas, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, cool. That was a good story.